You're listening to The Builder's Mindset with Mike DiGiovanni, presented by Amazing Mindsets. All right, welcome to another episode of The Builder's Mindset. I was all set to do a talk on the dock worker strike, and then surprisingly, or not so surprisingly, it went away. As fast as it was a headline, it went away. And I was expecting it to still go on, but then as it went away so quickly, I wasn't so surprised. I don't want to delve too much, and I'm going to try to stay away from overt politics on this podcast, at least for now. That may change, but it does seem a little interesting that the talk about it's been around for a little bit, and the union workers in an election cycle, the head of the union, I forget the gentleman's name, but he was very stern. He pulled no punches about what they were willing to do. And to be quite honest, I thought it was, pretty brazen, his language and the tone and tenor that he used. Not saying I disagree. It's a negotiation, right? Everything's a negotiation. And I just thought it was surprising because, we typically, I'm based out of the West Coast, SoCal. You don't typically get a lot of noise about the East Coast docks. No shade to those folks there, but so much talk about international commerce is the West Coast, the ports of Long Beach and LA. A lot of that I think comes from, so much stuff comes from Asia. It comes right across the Pacific, and here it is. And it's kind of interesting that it went away so quick, so close to an election, or maybe it's not so surprising. But as I said, I was prepared to record this and release this in a window of time that it would still be going on, so we could talk about its impact on the home building industry, because that's what we talk about here on The Builder's Mindset. And as I sat down to record this episode in my new office space, so if there's a little bit of an echo, I apologize. The carpet's not come yet, so there might be a bit of an echo. But as I sat down to record this, and just so you know, lately I've been a little hand to mouth with these episodes. I've been recording them maybe one in advance, two in advance, and typically later in the week right before the release. So right now I'm actually recording this on Thursday, the 10th of October. This will come out over the weekend, but most of you will hear about it on Monday for the official release, the 11th, 12th, 14th. I think that is Monday the 14th. But it'll actually come out tomorrow. We're pretty quick about the turnaround here. And so as I thought about it, and I'm like, well, what's there to talk about as it relates to the dock strike? It's over. And then it dawned on me. The dock strike was big news from a home builder perspective because so much of what goes into houses in this country either is manufactured overseas or its components come from overseas. And I heard an interesting thing the other day. A builder made a comment to one of my clients that they did not want to use their product because they only like to use American-based products. And so the dock strike, even though it's over, brought up for me this idea of like the remembrance of the supply chain issues of COVID and price increases. So you've got cost and availability that are impacted by the supply chain. And so the supply chain can be impacted in a variety of different ways, right? Raw material shortages, natural disasters that create problems, labor issues in factories and assembly plants that make the finished goods, just all different kinds of things that can affect both the price and the availability of those components. And I think if you remember some of the previous podcasts, I talk about, from a home builder's perspective, schedule is king. Don't mess with a home builder schedule. I've told all of my subcontractor clients, you have to figure out how to work with the scheduling needs, desires, and goods and bads of the builder, because at the end of the day, you cannot slow that process down. It's kind of like for some of us older Gen X or baby boomer age folks, if you remember that I Love Lucy show, you know, when they're doing the chocolates in the little packaging and they kind of start to get a little behind, and Lucy's like eating them to like not have them overflow, and they start to overflow. It's kind of almost like the opposite in a sense from what we're trying to manage here building a house is things don't show up on time, and then the assembly line starts to bog down, and that creates a whole laundry list of problems. There's a saying in home building that nothing good happens between the start of a home and the close of a home. People will make fun of the production home building industry and say, oh, they build these fast, cheap houses. And what I'll tell you is in the production home building world, the fastest built home is usually the best built home because it flows smoothly. There's not multiple days where things sit and get weathered with rain and theft and vandalism and you name it. Homes that build fast and consistently, something's happening in every home every day, are better homes. So schedule is king. So when the dock worker strike was upon us for, I think it lasted 36 hours, give or take. A lot of hubbub. I was getting lots of texts and emails and phone calls with people about, oh my God, what was this going to do? How was this going to impact? Some of my clients were concerned. And, you know, at the end of the day, it got resolved. No surprise. Like I do think behind the scenes, there were some strings being pulled potentially to give a win to certain political entities to help. I won't, no conspiracy theory there. Ha ha. But it does bring into question some of these things like globalization versus reshoring, onshoring, whatever you want to call it. It brings into question like how stable is the supply chain? How stable is the safety stock of inventory? What's in store for prices? So here's what's interesting. Lots of talk about inflation and getting inflation in check, but also with rising or declining interest rates, which tends to usually push pricing up, and that could be a whole other episode that we could talk about. But the dock workers' increase in pay, I believe, is ultimately going to raise container prices, and container prices are higher now than they've been probably in the last couple of years. I think they softened up a little bit in the last few months. And I think there are some folks out there who don't think this is going to have a big impact on dock prices because it's just the East Coast. And as I talked about, lower traffic coming through there. But as we see, when the system gets taxed a little bit, it tends to get spread out. And these container companies are non-American based, most of them, as I understand it. They're global companies, and they supply containers for West Coast shipping, East Coast shipping. So that cost that now is going to hit those containers that are coming into the East Coast ports, my theory is that that's going to raise container prices just globally. I don't see that impacting just East Coast shipments. So we'll put that as a note just to think about. Like I believe ultimately that's gonna increase container costs. And what do you think increased container costs do to the cost of the end product? It increases it. It's just like that. That's pretty much straightforward. But what happens to that cost is the big question as we think about this. You know, when an input into a home or something that goes into a home goes up, there's a decision that has to be made all along the supply chain. Container costs go up, so the goods that are coming in cost more per unit. If that's a finished good, the company selling that finished good or using that finished good has to decide what to do with the product, that product that's on the container they're selling. Do they raise the price or take the margin depreciation? If it's a component that goes into another finished good, that company that's manufacturing or assembling something here in the United States, getting that product, they have to decide as well, do we do we pass that on, or do we just take the margin depreciation? And look, we could talk all about like where the shipping costs go, if it's FOB factory, or who ends up incurring that. But at the end of the day, that is a cost that is going to go up. And so where that lands, that'll be interesting to see, because as I talked about, interest rates were dropped 0.5%. Another thing that I thought was very suspect so close to the election. I didn't think we should have done one before the election, let alone 0.5 point. But interest rates going down tend to make money cheaper, tend to make prices rise. Inflation data just came out at 2.4%, I believe, and 3.3, not counting the non-volatile components. And I think that's because fuel seems to be a little lower than it has been. Let's see how that holds out with what's going on in the Middle East. And so inflation is not, if my understanding is that the Fed's target for inflation is 2%. So we're still a little north of that. Yes, we're much lower than we were, and everybody's kind of exuberant and jubilant, and we're like high on the, the headlines of like these lower inflation rates, tamed inflation rates, but they're still higher than the Fed target, and the Fed's dropping rates. So I feel we're in really bizarre, uncharted waters as it comes to the cost of goods that are going to impact housing. And I think this makes pricing very sticky. And it makes it sticky in a time where all of this is happening and we're hoping that mortgage rates go down. And we talked about interest rates a couple episodes ago, but mortgage rates really haven't come down. And the yield curve is no longer inverted. And so, yes, mortgage rates went down the week leading up to the Fed's reduction, but they're kind of back up again and they're holding steady. And so that means, as I mentioned in that interest rate podcast, builders don't have that money to put in their pocket that they've been using as incentives to buy down the mortgage rates. So they've got that pressure. Lennar, as we mentioned in a couple episodes ago, got kind of pounded for their margin because they missed. And now you still have 2.4 to 3.3 inflation rates, depending upon which measure you're using. We're going to have, this is my prediction, we're going to have increased container prices, or sustained. The container prices did come down a few months back a little bit, but I don't see that sticking because now there's added cost into that input. Now, all of that has me thinking then about, you're going to have, as I talked about, builders pushing down on their direct costs. They're going to try to maximize the profit that they can get out of the lots they have on the existing communities that have already been bid out. I continue to hear about very aggressive pricing in the marketplace for new bids. And all of this comes down to these inflationary pressures are pushing up, and you have all these different entities that are trying to maintain or grow top line and bottom line numbers, revenue and profit. And so, I was reading something on the NHB, I was reading their report, most recent, about lumber. And lumber has kind of been steady. It's not horrible, but it's not near historic lows. And we're going into that time of year that I've talked about in the past. Curtailments are coming. This is when mills tend to shut down factories for quote unquote maintenance. Not to say that they don't really need it, but it does help drive that cost of their product up. And then lo and behold, we're in what I would consider to be a very, very active hurricane season. And typically speaking, in these active hurricane season, and my hearts go out to the people in all the areas of the Southeast, particularly Asheville, North Carolina, how devastating what's going on there. And then just Milton and what Milton has just done in Florida. And let's not forget Beryl. Just like, we're talking a very active season that, beyond all the disruption and just the chaos and loss of life that creates, when we're talking from a building perspective and a cost, that's really what we discuss here on the show. I foresee real upward pressure on panel pricing, OSB, plywood, etc., because that's typically what happens. You're going to have to do new roofs. That's going to require plywood, OSB, depending upon your market. You've got windows broken out. You've got storefronts need to be boarded, like you name it, there's going to be a run on sheet goods. And so that's going to push that up. And then if you look at the nature of some of the devastation, my gut tells me we're going to see a run on stick lumber too, because these last few hurricanes have been just crazy strong and caused significant damage. So, go back to the dock worker thing, because that's what I was going to put this episode about, and it's really been a little bit about that, but it's grown for me more into thinking about the supply and demand economics is what we're going to see going into 2025. We're also in an interesting time because, as I said, we're in a sort of a time where there's not as many bids as we've been used to. A lot of bids got put out, they're done, or they're out there getting renegotiated to get firmed up. And there's not a whole lot, with certain exceptions, there's not a whole lot of new bids coming out right now in October, November, December. I don't see a lot of them. I also think it's going to be slow in January and February from a bidding perspective. And as we talked about trade partners in the one episode, I said, builders are fishing for lower costs, and a lot of trade partners are biting. But it's going to turn. There are lots of land deals in the pipeline that just have not made it to opening, have not made it to contract. And it's going to be interesting to see what happens when that turn happens. So, but back to the supply demand and the cost constraints and this sort of dock worker strike and how this, affects things. The supply chain for everything beyond housing, but housing in particular, is always going to have a major component that's international. So, those builders that I've heard mention, like we prefer American products, I think there's a twofold reason for that. I think some of them, think they're creating some sense of stability in their supply chain with that. And there's a little bit of truth in that, not massive, and it's not massive because of everything is ultimately globalized to some degree or another. And the other reason is, a lot of them just, want to buy things in America, right? Like help the American economy, and they believe that that's good for the American economy. And to some degree, that is true as well. But it is ultimately, we live in a global society. We live in a global economic system. And so there is always going to be demand for and a need for those components or finished goods coming from overseas. And so the dock worker strike, in my opinion, just put a little bit of a reminder to a lot of people of what the COVID times did to the supply chain. And so I think there was a bit of push, and in the election cycle, I ultimately think neither party probably wanted the strike to be extended, but I think there was a desire to get it solved pretty quickly. Which they did, and ultimately it's a good thing. But the cost, I think the dock workers got a 66% or 67% wage increase. That's going to get passed through somehow, some way to pricing. And that leads me to what the next episode is going to be about. I'm going to talk a little bit more in depth about purchasing and the cost to build a home from a production builder side, the geographic impacts of that, the supply chain impacts of that, your volume and scale, how that impacts that both on a national contracting level as well as on a local level, because I think you'd be surprised at the variation in cost to build a home. And there's a lot of factors that impact that. And as I mentioned a few episodes ago, at the end of the day, if your job is looking like it's not going to hit the numbers you thought, by the time you find that out, usually that it's not good, the last line of defense is your vertical construction costs, those things that go into the home, not the land, not the sewer and storm and the pipes and all that make the land development or the infrastructure. It's the house, the foundation, the framing, the roof, and the stuff that goes inside. And I think we're headed for some interesting times, because I do believe that inflation, it's sticky. I am not going to forecast any kind of deflation, and I'm not a macroeconomist, so I'd love to hear from some of the folks who are really smart about this. There had been some discussion about some deflationary issues maybe kind of coming, and I think there was for a little while, a little undertone current of concern of like what Japan went through, I want to say, for 30 years or so, and I wonder if maybe that's why the Fed, the independent Fed, Lowered rates by 0.5 point within 2 months of an election. Because I think ultimately the Fed would rather have a little heated inflation than deflation. Because you want to keep people spending and buying, particularly with the economy the way it is right now and what's going on. So anyway, it's going to be interesting to see what happens in costs for home building over the next 3 to 6 months. We'll continue to come back and report back on it. And like I said, next week we're going to talk about purchasing from a high level perspective. After that, we're going to talk about construction, operations scheduling, and quality. And then we're going to start really diving into the fun part as we get into episode 9. I'm going to talk about product development and how to control the things you can control as a home builder, the design of your homes, taking ownership of that, designing homes that reduce cost so that you can lower your cost, be more competitive on your sell price, and do so without sacrificing the quality of your product, without sacrificing your trade partner margins, and getting to a better number without just asking the outside of your world, the supply chain and those who install it, to just squeeze and compress their margins. Because I think right now that's the place that we're at. I think for builders to improve their margins, the system has to compress elsewhere, and that's either in the materials coming in or the labor coming over to install those materials. I think that's the environment that we're in for the next 6 to 18 months. If we don't take a good hard look at how we put a house together and how we design it, and I'll give you some tips and some tricks of things that I've had success with in the past of how to do that. And then episode 11, my goal is I've got an invitation out to a very special guest that will be able to come on the podcast and then follow up talk about product development. So we've got a great lineup coming up in the next few weeks: purchasing, construction, product development, and then a deep dive with a product development expert. And I hope you're enjoying these episodes. If so, please subscribe, leave a comment on topics you'd like us to talk about. And we look forward to bringing this show to you every week. Have a great day. Thanks for listening to The Builder's Mindset with Mike DiGiovanni, presented by Amazing Mindsets. Remember, your mindset matters